Hello, I'm Carol.
Hi, I'm Lisa, and welcome to the Grief Gurus, a place for honest conversations about grief, loss, and coping.
We believe grief is part of your story, but it's not the whole of your story. And today we're going to be chatting about anticipatory grief. And for those of you who aren't quite sure what that is, it's the grief we feel when somebody has been given a terminal diagnosis. Now, that might be Alzheimer's, it might be cancer, and it's the grief that you feel as you are approaching an expected loss. And so, Lisa, I'm going to ask you about this because our situations were quite different. My husband was an adult, your little girl was baby. And I think the anticipatory grief would have been quite different. So, can you explain a little bit about what your experience was for the listeners?
Yeah, this is a great conversation because for me, anticipatory grief isn't, um, you're right, it's much different if it's an adult or a child. And for me, when I first heard this term, and I'm not that familiar with it, to be honest, it's a good conversation. To me, it was more, grieving in advance, just like the terminology
Hmm.
sounds. But for me, it was more like rehearsing, rehearsing what it would be like, rehearsing um, what the ultimate, moment would feel like, what it would be like when she was gone. And the best way I can describe it is and because this is something I've revisited over time with different challenges, particularly with my son, who
Hmm.
does also sometimes run into some serious diagnoses. At the end of the day, it sort of was like borrowing grief in a sense. Um, at the time with Alexis, my daughter, I think I believed in some way that rehearsing what it would be like would make it easier, or how will I feel. I let my head go in all different directions with that, and to some degree we can't control that. But what I will say, and what I later learned, was no matter what you think it's going to be like, number one, it's
It isn't.
not like that. And also borrowing it in advance, I guess I would just suggest that doing that is, it's not only kind of torture, but it doesn't
Hmm.
help.
Doesn't
It's
help.
just that you started earlier, and we can't totally control what our minds do. But what was that experience like for you with Brian? Because you
Hmm.
had a little bit more time, I think, also.
Yeah. Well, we had 6 years actually, and I didn't know it was anticipatory grief because, like most people, I'd never spoken about grief. I had no idea about it. Um, but because he was fully with it, there was no issue. It was a cancer diagnosis. We were able to prepare and do more of the practical things that adults need to do. So, planning a funeral, what music we wanted, all of those things, making sure the bank stuff was all in order, making
Wow.
sure the will was all in order. What I didn't do, and what I suggest to my clients, is make sure you know what passwords people have for things. Luckily, I knew where they were, but
That's wild.
so now these days we have so many passwords and bank logins and different things, and if all of a sudden you're left and you need to access stuff and you can't, that's an issue. So I was lucky because we could do that. But of course, if we're dealing with somebody with dementia, you may not have that option. But I think anticipatory grief, it allows us to do some planning if you can. And of course, we really should be thinking about these things before anybody gets sick. I'm just going to say that. We should
Yeah,
know about these, right? We don't want to wait till somebody's sick and, that would be the ideal, but it's not what most of us do. And I think the other thing to understand in anticipatory grief is that it is a type of grief, and you are maybe losing a person just very slowly, particularly in Alzheimer's. A little bit of them
yes.
is being lost, and you might be caregiving, you might be absolutely exhausted, you might be running to appointments, you might be trying to do all of these things, and just the emotional load of that is exhausting. So you can feel some of the things for grief in anticipatory grief, and then I think you're so right. And that moment comes, and you think, well, I'm sort of prepared, which is what I thought I was, and I'm not. I wasn't prepared at all because when your person dies, you are just not prepared for that. And I think, no, don't practice it. I think that must have been torturous.
Yeah.
But we don't know what it's going to be like when our person finally takes their last breath. And I think we can prepare some of the practicalities, but I'm not sure we can prepare our hearts for it. And I think it's still a shock. And then we go into the lethargy of grief and all of the other things that come along with grief. But I think some of those can start early on, but I think a lot of it is through the absolute exhaustion of having to do stuff and caretaking, which I'm sure you experienced as you were looking after your daughter.
Yeah. You know, much of the time that she was ill, I mean, we were in the hospital, children's hospital, for weeks. You know, I think our longest
Hmm.
admission was like 9 weeks. And at the point that we came home, you know, she lived for about a week in the home with hospice care. But because of that, I didn't. I mean, I would say I was exhausted chronically, but from a day to day perspective, I wasn't running around or doing things. I mean, but I was kind of stuck holding her most of the time. And
Yeah.
because my body was still, my mind would really race. And so I would be
Hmm.
rocking her and I'd be thinking, oh my God, I'm going to miss this. And so it's not even just sort of anticipating the actual death itself. Is, you know, I'm thinking about, well, how's my life going to be different? What am I going to do with
Yeah.
myself? You know, where do I begin? And so, yeah, borrowing it is definitely a bad idea, but to some degree, you know,
Yeah.
we can't help ourselves.
We No, we can't. It was interesting. I did a class yesterday, and a lady's father had died, and she said here it was 7 to 10 days in the hospital. She said it was the anticipation was worse than the grief I'm feeling now, which was interesting for me. And I think it goes to show that we don't know how we're going to respond. It doesn't matter how pragmatic you are, how prepared you are. You don't know how it's going to be for you. And so she found that very, very difficult, even though her father, so anticipatory grief is something that we go through as we see people who are slowly fading away. It is very difficult emotionally, physically, and it is a real thing. And I think people don't really understand that you are already grieving at this point.
Very true. And because we don't know how the death affects us in the very immediacy of it, but it's down the road, a year, 2 years, 3 years. Um, the grief that I felt when my daughter died was devastating. And yet I still have moments of devastation based on the environment that I'm in. If I see a
Yeah.
little girl, you know, dancing with her dad at a wedding, and I can say, I'll never, you know, my daughter's not here to dance with her dad, with my husband, that triggers something in me. So it's hard to know, you know, again, grief is so nuts, right? We
It
just
is.
don't
It's
know
tricky.
anything about it. But to encourage our listeners, this is why we are having these conversations, because I wish I had known about anticipatory grief when my daughter was
Yep.
sick. Maybe I would have allowed myself to not spend so much time, you know, with my brain running
Yeah.
wild and things. So,
And I will say, actually, I have quite a few clients, coaching clients, who are in anticipatory grief. Not,
mm,
they haven't, they haven't lost their loved one yet.
wow.
They're needing support now as they're going through this. So don't be afraid to reach out to somebody when you are going through this, because you still need support. We've talked about this. It's so important to have somewhere where you can go and say, "Oh, I'm just exhausted with it all. I'm so tired. I'm frightened. I'm scared.
Yeah,
I don't know what it's going to be like. I can't imagine my life." You need somebody who can hear that, and our friends and family can't always hear that, can they?
probably not, because they
No.
may be doing their own, you know, version
Yeah,
of
of course.
anticipatory grief. I did
Yeah.
have a participant in one of my support circles where the woman joined just because she had just placed her husband in long-term care, who
Hmm.
had Alzheimer's. He since
Yeah.
passed. But
Yeah.
that's so true. And if you are in that situation, it really does warrant some support even now, because moving into that time will be difficult. And so many things will be different if you have someone who can kind of walk that path with you right along. It's a really good way to take care of ourselves. So, well, thank you so much for Carol for explaining anticipatory grief. And I know I learned something today. Hopefully our listeners have as well. Please go ahead and like our episode and subscribe, and we'll see you back here at the Grief Gurus in our next chat.